It's my honor and a privilege to introduce Dr. Feenberg. Dr. Feenberg is the Canadian Research Chair in the field of the philosophy of technology at Simon Fraser University. Dr. Feenberg has taught in several different institutions in different countries, such as Duke University in the United States, University of Tokyo in Japan, University of Paris 1 in France. Dr. Feenberg is the globally well-known media scholar and the philosopher. He has written more than 10 books, including Marcuse's Critical Theory and the Promise of Utopia, Critical Theory of the Technology, Transforming Technology, Communication in the Digital Age, so on and so forth. Recently, he wrote the book titled Between Vision and the Experience. Also, he edited one journal, Information Society. Dr. Feenberg will be delivering a speech titled 10 Paradoxes of Technology. Please join in welcoming Dr. Feenberg.
I'm going to, is this working? I'm going to read the paper and show some slides illustrated as I go along. Strange design. Okay. And afterwards, I'd be happy to answer questions, and hopefully we can have a discussion. This paper presents a philosophy of technology. It draws on what we have learned in the last 30 years as we abandoned old Heideggerian and positivist notions and face the real world of technology. It turns out that most of our common sense ideas about technology are wrong. This is why I put my 10 propositions in the form of paradoxes, although I use the word loosely here rather to refer to the counterintuitive nature of much of what we know now about technology. First paradox, the paradox of the parts and the whole. Martin Heidegger once asked whether birds fly because they have wings or have wings because they fly. The question seems silly, but it offers an original entry point for reflection on technology and development. Birds appear to be equipped with wings, and it is this that explains their ability to fly. This is the obvious common sense answer to Heidegger's question. But this answer has implications that are less than obvious. Although our intuitions tell us birds belong in the air, our language seems to say that they are separate from the environment on which they act, and even separate from the equipment they use to cope with that environment. Birds use wings to fly in something like the way in which we humans use airplanes. Pursuing the analogy, we could say that if birds did not have wings, they would be just as earthbound as were humans before the Wright brothers invented the airplane. But this makes no sense. Although there are a few species of flightless birds, most birds could not survive without flying. Flying is not just something birds do, it is their very being. A better analogy to birds' flight would be human speech. Although speechless humans do exist, they lack an essential aspect of what it is to be human. Speech is not properly understood as a tool humans use to communicate, because without it, they are not fully human. Speech, like flight for birds, is essential in a way that tools are not. One can pick up and put down a tool, but humans can no more abandon speech than birds can abandon flight. Pushed to the extreme, the common sense answer to Heidegger's puzzling question breaks down. Of course, we usually do not fall into such absurdities when talking about animals, but the misleading implications of ordinary language do reflect our inadequate common sense understanding of technology. This has consequences I will discuss in the rest of this paper. Heidegger's second option, that birds have wings because they fly, challenges us in a different way. It seems absurd on the face of it. How can birds fly unless they have wings? So flying cannot be the cause of wings unless an effect can receive its cause. If we're going to make any sense of Heidegger's point, we need to reformulate it in less paradoxical language. Here's what he really means. Birds belong to a specific niche in the environment. That niche consists of treetops in which to dwell, insects to eat, and so on. It is only available to a specific type of animal with a specific type of body. Flying, as a necessary property of an organism that occupies this particular niche, requires wings, rather than the other way around, as common sense would have it. This is a holistic conception of the relation of the animal to its environment. We are not to think of birds, insects, and trees as fully separate things, but rather as forming a system in which each relates essentially to the other. But this is not an organic whole, the parts of which are so intimately connected they can only be separated by destroying the organism. In the case of an animal and its niche, separation is possible, at least temporarily, although it threatens the survival of the animal and perhaps of other elements of the environment dependent on it. These relationships are a bit like those of a part of a machine to the whole machine. The part can be separated from the whole, but then it loses its function. A tire that has been removed from a car continues to be a tire, but it cannot do the things tires are meant to do. Following Heidegger's thought, it is easy to see that the form and even the existence of tires such as we know them depends on the whole car they are destined to serve. And the reciprocal also holds. Car and tire are mutually interdependent. The car is not just assembled from pre-existing parts, since the nature of the parts is derived from the design of the car, and vice versa. The car does not ride on the road because it has tires. Rather, the tires belong to the car because the car rides on the road. I will call this the paradox of the parts and the whole. The apparent, here is the text, the apparent origin of complex wholes lies in their parts. But paradoxical though it seems, in reality the parts find their origin in the whole to which they belong. I want to illustrate this paradox with two images, each of which exemplifies the two answers to Heidegger's question in graphic terms. The first of these images shows a carburetor in a manufacturer's catalog. Over there. As you can see, it is a wonder of sharp-edged surfaces and smooth curves in cold, shiny steel. It is completely separate from its environment. It just floats. And it fulfills the dream of reason, the dream of pure order. Now look at the second image by the painter Walter Murch. We are once again in the presence of a carburetor, but this time it is portrayed as a warm and fuzzy object that blurs into the air around it. It is compared subtly with a sprouting onion over to the left, which establishes a scale that contradicts its strangely monumental aspect. This is a romantic rather than a rationalistic image. It hints at the history and the connectedness of the thing rather than emphasizing its engineering perfection. Which image is truer to life? I prefer Murch's, which I used as cover art for a book called Questioning Technology. Murch sets us thinking about technology's complexity, the environment in which it functions, the history out of which it arises, rather than answering the question in advance with a nod to its supposedly pure rationality. Examples that confirm the point are easy to find. A technology imported or imitated from a developed country is implanted in a new environment in a less developed country. It is expected that it will perform in the same way everywhere, that it is not a local phenomenon bound to a particular history and environment. In this respect, technologies differ from such rooted phenomena as customs or language. Difficult though it be to transfer Western industrial technology to a poor country, it is far easier than importing such things as a different cuisine, or different relations between men and women, or a different language. So we say that technology is universal, in contrast to these particular and local features. And this is usually correct to a considerable extent. Of course, it makes no sense to send tractors to farmers who have no access to gasoline. Such gross mistakes are occasionally made. But for the most part, the problems are more subtle and are often overlooked for a long time. For example, industrial pollutants that were evacuated safely by a good sewage system in a rich country may poison wells in a new, much poorer locale. Differences in culture, too, pose problems. The keyboards of typewriters and computers Japan imported from the West could not represent its written language because of the Chinese characters. I'm sure it's easier in Korea because you have an alphabet. Before a technical adaptation was found, some Japanese concluded that modernization would require the adoption of English. Good sewage systems and Roman alphabets form a niche essential to the proper functioning of these technologies, just like the water in which fish swim. Technologies resemble animals in belonging to a specific niche in a specific society. They do not work well, if at all, outside that context. But the fact that technologies can be detached from their appropriate niche means they can be imported without bringing along all the contextual elements necessary for their proper function. Technologies can be plucked from the environment in which they originated and dropped into a new environment without afterthoughts. But this can be a formula for disaster. Consider the adoption of the private automobile by China as a primary means of transportation. In February 2009, auto sales in China surpassed those in the United States for the first time. China is now the largest market for private cars in the whole world. This is not surprising given the size of China's population, but for that very reason, it was foolish to commit so many resources to the automobile. Automobiles are a very inefficient means of transportation. They consume a great deal of fuel for every passenger mile driven. China is so big that its participation in oil markets will eventually push prices up to the point where the private automobile will become unaffordable to operate. Meanwhile, China will have built its cities around automotive transportation with consequences that will be very expensive to replace. Mistakes such as this occur because policymakers fail to realize the dependence of the parts on the whole. In this, they resemble ordinary people everywhere in modern societies. Our common sense misleads us into imagining that technologies can stand alone. This is called the paradox of the obvious. Why do we think like this? Why does common sense tend to validate the first of the two images, the carburetor in the catalog, rather than Walter Rich's carburetor? I find the answer to these questions in another paradox, which I will call the paradox of the obvious. Here is a general formulation. What is most obvious is most hidden. An amusing corollary dramatizes the point. Fish do not know that they are wet. Now, I may be wrong about fish, but I suspect the last thing they think about is the medium of their existence, water, the niche to which they are so perfectly adapted. A fish out of water quickly dies, but it is difficult to imagine fish enjoying a bath. Well, water is what fish take for granted, just as we humans take air for granted. We know that we are wet because water is not our natural medium. It exists for us in contrast to air. But like fish who do not know they are wet, we do not think about the air we breathe. We have many other experiences in which the obvious withdraws from view. For example, when we watch a movie, we quickly lose sight of the screen as a screen. We forget that all the action takes place in the same spot at a certain distance in front of us on a flat surface. This is especially true when watching Avatar. A spectator, unable to ignore the obvious, would fail to foreground the action of the film and would remain disturbingly conscious of the screen. The medium recedes into the background, and what we notice in the foreground are the effects it makes possible. This explains why we see the possession of wings as the adequate explanation of flying, and why it looks to us like machines are composed of independent parts. Third paradox, the paradox of the origin. Our forgetfulness also blinds us to the history of technical objects. These objects differ from ordinary things and people in the way they relate to time. This person, that book, the tree behind our house all have a past, and that past can be read on his wrinkled and smiling face, the dog-eared pages of the book, the stump of the branch that broke from the tree in the last storm. In such cases, the presence of the past in the present seems for us unremarkable. but technologies seem disconnected from their past. We usually have no idea where they came from, how they developed, the conditions under which the decisions were made that determined their futures. They seem self-sufficient in their rational functioning. An adequate explanation of any given device appears to consist in tracing the causal connections between its parts. But in reality, there is just as much history to an electric toaster or a nuclear power plant as there is to persons, books, and trees. No device emerged full-blown from the logic of its function. Every process of development is fraught with contingencies, choices, alternative possibilities. The perfecting of a technical object obliterates the traces of the labor of its construction and the social forces that were in play as its design was fixed. It is this process that adjusts the object to its niche, and so the occlusion of its history contributes to the forgetfulness of the whole to which it belongs. I call this the paradox of the origin. Behind everything rational, there lies a forgotten history. Okay, here's an example with which we are all familiar. What could be more rational than lighted exit signs and outward opening doors in theaters? Yet in the United States, these simple life-saving devices were not mandated by any law or regulation until the famous Iroquois Theater fire in Chicago in 1903. Some 600 people died trying to find and open the exits. Thereafter, cities all over the country introduced strict safety regulations. Today, we do not take much notice of exit signs and doors, and certainly few theater doors have an idea of their origin. We think, if we think at all, that they are surely there as useful precautions. But the history shows us that this is not the full explanation. A contingent fact, a particular incident, lies behind the logic of theater design. So now we're ready for paradox 4, the paradox of the frame. There is a corollary of the paradox of the origin. I call this fourth paradox the paradox of the frame, and formulate it as follows. Efficiency does not explain success. Success explains efficiency. This is counterintuitive. Our common sense tells us that technologies succeed because they are good at doing their job. Efficiency is the measure of their worth and explains why they are chosen from among many possible alternatives. But the history of technology tells a different story. Often at the beginning of the line of development, none of the alternatives work very well by the standards of a later time when one of them has enjoyed many generations of innovation and improvement. When we look back from the standpoint of the improved device, we are fooled into thinking its obvious superiority explains its success. Well, this looks completely ridiculous compared to a modern bicycle. But the modern bicycle has had 100 years of development, so it's not a fair comparison. That superiority results, the superiority of the modern technology results from the original choice that privileged the successful technology over the alternatives and not vice versa. So what does explain that choice? Again, the history of technology helps us. It shows that many different criteria are applied by the social actors who have the power to make the choice. Sometimes economic criteria prevail, sometimes technical criteria, such as the fit of the device with other technologies in the environment, sometimes social or political requirements of one sort or another. In other words, there is no general rule under which paths of development can be explained. Explanation by efficiency is a little like explaining the presence of pictures in a museum by the fact that they all have frames. Of course, all technologies must be more or less efficient, but that does not explain why they are present in our technical environment. In each case, only a study of the contingent circumstances of success and failure tells the whole story. The next paradox is called the paradox of action. This brings me to my fifth paradox. I think of this as a metaphoric corollary of Newton's third law of motion. Newton's law states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. This law is verified every time two billiard balls bounce off each other. My corollary applies this model to human behavior. It most obviously applies in interpersonal relations, where anger evokes anger, kindness, kindness, and so on. Every one of our acts returns to us in some form as feedback from the other. But this means that in acting, we become the object of action. In more formal philosophical language, the paradox of action says that human beings can only act on a system to which they themselves belong. Because we belong to the system, any change we make in it affects us too. That's by definition. In the nature of systems. This is the practical significance of our existence as embodied as social beings. Through our body and our social belonging, we participate in a world of causal powers and meanings we do not fully control. We are exposed through our body to the laws of nature, and we are born into a cultural world we largely take as given. In short, we are finite beings. Our finitude shows up in the Newtonian reciprocity of action and reaction. But technical action appears to be non-Newtonian, an exception to the rule of reciprocity. When we act technically on an object, there seems to be very little feedback to us, certainly nothing proportionate to our impact on the object. But this is an illusion, the illusion of technique. It blinds us to three reciprocities of technical action. These are causal side effects of technology, changes in the meaning of our world, and changes in our own identity. It is only when we narrowly define the relevant zone of action that we appear to be independent of the objects on which we act technically. In context, action always conforms to my version of Newton's law and comes back to affect the actor. The illusion of independence arises from the nature of technical action, which dissipates or defers causal feedback from the object. Indeed, the whole point of technology is to change the world more than the actor. It is no accident that the gun harms the rabbit, but not the hunter. That the hammer transforms the stack of lumber, but not the carpenter. Tools are designed to focus power outward on the world, while protecting the tool user from that equal and opposite reaction Newton proclaimed. But Newton cannot be defied for long. In one way or another, the reaction will manifest itself. In the case of pollution, all one need do to identify the reaction is to enlarge the context in space and time and wait for the chickens to come home to roost. Barry Commoner's ecological corollary of Newton's law declares that, quote, everything goes somewhere, end quote. Indeed, all the poisons produced by industry end up in someone's backyard, even if it takes years to notice. As technology grows more powerful, its negative side effects become more difficult to avoid, and finally, it is impossible to ignore the dangers they create. But this observation brings us back to our first three paradoxes. The paradox of the parts of the whole states the importance of the niche or context. That niche must include a way of absorbing the impact of the technology, including its waste products. But attention to this aspect of technology is often obscured by a narrow conception of technical action. The paradox of the obvious works against recognizing this connection. The feedback that is invisible in the immediate zone of action becomes visible when a wider or longer range view is available. The paradox of the origin wipes the slate clean and obscures the history in which past feedback influenced current designs. In modern society, technologies are perceived as purely instrumental and separate from their past, the environment in which they function, and their operators, like those wings that cause birds to fly. But these apparent separations hide essential aspects of technology, as we have seen. I have called ignorance of this principle the illusion of technology. This illusion is less of a problem in traditional societies. There, craft knowledge and everyday experience are in constant communication. The lessons learned from using technical devices are absorbed into the craft tradition, where they limit and control technical action. From a modern standpoint, this appears to be an obstacle to development. But there may be wisdom in restraint. Certainly our recent experience with technologies such as nuclear weapons and toxic chemicals indicate a need for restraint. But this is not the way most modern technology has developed. Under capitalism, control of technology is no longer in the hands of craftsmen, but is transferred to the owners of enterprise and their agents. Capitalist enterprise is unusual among social institutions in having a very narrow goal, profit, and the freedom to pursue that goal without regard for consequences. Once technology has been delivered over to such an institution, the lessons of experience are ignored. Workers, users of technology, victims of its side effects, all are silenced throughout the industrialization process. Technological development can proceed without regard for the more remote aspects of its own context. This makes possible the development of sophisticated technical disciplines and very rapid progress, but with unfortunate side effects. In communist countries, this same pattern prevailed under government control, where the goal assigned to state enterprises, meeting a quota, was similarly narrow. Instead of correcting the illusion of technology, modern societies take the illusion for reality. They imagine they can act on the world without consequences for themselves. But only God can act on objects from outside the world, outside the system on which he acts. All human action, including technical action, exposes the actor. The illusion of godlike power is dangerous. When Robert Oppenheimer witnessed the explosion of the first atom bomb, this was in a test in New Mexico in 1945, a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita flashed through his mind. And this is the quote: "I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." But soon he was attempting to negotiate disarmament with Moscow. He realized the shatterer could be shattered. Presumably Shiva, the god of death, does not have to worry about the Russians. Our actions not only come back to us through causal feedback, they also change the meaning of our world. The most dramatic examples of such transformations of meaning occur around new technologies of transportation and communication. Railroads and later automobiles and airplanes have radically diminished the experience of distance. Regions once remote were suddenly made close by these technologies. The spatial coordinates of our lives, what we mean by far and near, are completely different from what they were for all of human history before these inventions were introduced. This is an effect on meaning, not a causal effect, but a hermeneutic effect. Added to these changes, electronic communication has radical consequences as a multicultural world gradually emerges from the monocultures of old. Speaking English in Korea. Ordinary people now know more about foreign lands and cultures from movies, encounters with immigrants, and tourism than all but a few adventurers and colonial administrators a century ago. What is more, such familiar distinctions as those between public and private, work and home, are subverted as new technology brings the office into domestic spaces and extrudes creative activities and private fantasies into public arenas. Even the meaning of nature is subject to technological transformation. Take amniocentesis, for example. It allows the sex of the fetus to be identified early in pregnancy. Relatively few parents abort fetuses because of their sex. But the fact that this is possible transforms an act of God into a human choice. What formerly was a matter of luck can now be planned. Even choosing not to use the information has become a choice in favor of nature, whereas before, no choice was involved. Our society is now capable of technologizing reproduction, and this has changed its meaning for everyone, including those who do not use the technology. So the sixth paradox, the paradox of the meaning. The paradox of action also holds in the case of identity. The hunter kills a rabbit with his gun, and all he feels is a little pressure from the kickback of the weapon. Instead, there is an obvious disproportion between the effect of the action on the actor and his object. But the action does have significant consequences for the hunter. His identity is determined by his acts. That is to say, he is a hunter insofar as he hunts. This reverse action of technology on identity is true of everyone's productive activity in one way or another. In sum, you are what you do. Consumer society has brought the question of identity to the fore in another way. The technologies we use in daily life, such as automobiles, iPods, mobile phones, signify us as the kind of people we are. We now wear our technologies just as we wear clothes and jewelry, as forms of self-presentation. Today, not only are you what you do, but even more emphatically, you are what you use. These observations suggest a sixth paradox of the means, which follows directly from the paradox of action. The means are the end. That's the formulation. There is a weaker version of this paradox with which everyone is familiar. It is obvious that means and ends are not completely independent of each other. Common sense tells us not to expect much good to come of using bad means, even if the ends we have in view are benign. But my formulation is more radical. The point is not that means and ends are related, but that they are in fact one and the same thing over a wide range of technological issues. By this I mean that the changes in meaning and identity discussed above are often the most important effect of technological change, and not its ostensible purpose. Consider the example of the automobile again. Automobile ownership involves far more than transportation. It symbolizes the owner's status. In poor countries, it has an even greater symbolic charge than in rich ones, signifying the achievement of modernity and its vision of a rich and fulfilling life. It cannot be said in such cases that the means are separate from the ends. Possession of the means is already an end in itself, because identity is at stake in the relation to technology. Now we come to 7, the paradox of complexity. This brings me to a 7th paradox of complexity, which can be succinctly stated as simplification complicates. The corollary of the paradox of action flows from the nature of technology. This corollary flows from the nature of technology. As we have seen, technologies can be removed from their context and transferred to alien locales. But more profoundly considered, technology is in some sense already decontextualized even before it is transferred, even in its normal setting. By this I mean that creating a technology involves abstracting the useful aspects of materials from their natural connections. This constitutes a radical simplification of those materials. So radical, in fact, that it must be compensated by a recontextualization in a new technological niche where we find them transformed in a finished and working device. But the recontextualization is not always completely successful. Here's an example. To make the paper on which this lecture is printed, trees were removed from their place in the ecology of the forest, as they were reduced to simplified raw materials. That's what the picture shows. They were then transformed to become useful in a new context, the context of contemporary writing practices. That new context brought with it all sorts of constraints, such as size, thickness, compatibility with current printers, and so on. We recognize the paper as belonging to this new context. But the process of decontextualizing and recontextualizing technical objects sometimes results in unexpected problems. In the case in point, papermaking employs dangerous chemicals, and its poorly regulated pursuit causes air pollution and harm to rivers and their inhabitants. And some, in simplifying, technological projects such as papermaking produce new complications. This is why context matters. Ignorance of context is especially prevalent in developing societies that receive a great deal of transferred technology. Blindness to context and the consequence is the rule in such cases. Technologies adapted to one world disrupt another world. These complications become the occasion for popular reactions and protests as they impinge on the health and well-being of ordinary people. This proposition is tested over and over in one developing society after another. Where popular reaction leading to correctives is effectively suppressed, as it was in the Soviet Union, the consequences of development can be catastrophic. Severe chemical pollution of the air, water, and soil, extensive radioactive contamination, and declining fertility and life expectancy. And so this leads into the paradox of value and fact. As it grows more powerful and pervasive, it becomes more and more difficult to insulate technology from feedback from the underlying population. Workers, users, victims, and potential victims all have their say at some point. Their feedback provoked by maladaptation, negative side effects, or unrealized technical potential leads to interventions that constrain development and orient its path. Once mobilized to protect themselves, protesters attempt to impose the lessons of experience on the technical experts who possess the knowledge necessary to build working devices in a modern society. It appears superficially that two separate things, technical knowledge and everyday experience, interact in a clash of opposites. Technical experts sometimes decry what they think of as ideological interference with their pure and objective knowledge of nature. They protest that values and desires must not be allowed to muddy the waters of fact and truth. Protesters may make the corresponding error and renounce the experts in general, while nevertheless employing their technology constantly in everyday life. But in fact, technological knowledge and experience are complementary rather than opposed. Technical knowledge is incomplete without the input from experience that corrects its oversights and simplifications. Public protests indirectly reveal the complications unintentionally caused by those simplifications, or that is, aspects of nature so far overlooked by the experts. Protests work by formulating values and priorities. Demand for such things as safety, health, skilled employment, recreational resources, aesthetically pleasing cities testify to the failure of technology to adequately incorporate all the constraints of its environment. Eventually, those values will be incorporated into improved technical designs, and the conflict between the public and its experts will die down. Indeed, in years to come, the technical experts will forget the politics behind their reformed designs, and when new demands appear, will defend them as a product of pure and objective knowledge of nature. Values cannot enter technology without being translated into technological language. Simply wishing away inconvenient technical limitations will not work. The results of such a voluntaristic approach are disastrous, as the Chinese discovered in the Cultural Revolution. For something useful to come out of public interventions, experts must figure out how to formulate values as viable technical specifications. When that is accomplished, a new version of the contested technologies can be produced that is responsive to its context. In the process, values are translated into technical facts, and technology fits more smoothly into its niche. The structure of this process is a consequence of the technology cut off to a considerable extent from the experience of those who live with it and use it. But the experience of users and victims of technology eventually influences the technical codes that preside over design. Early examples emerge in the labor movement around health and safety at work. Later, such issues as food safety and environmental pollution signal the widening circle of affected publics. Today, as we have seen, such interactions are becoming routine, and new groups emerge frequently as worlds change in response to technological change. This overall dynamic of technological change closes the circle described in the paradox of action. What goes around comes around, California slang. And because we have experience and are capable of reflecting on it, we can change our technologies to safeguard ourselves and to support the new activities they make possible. Sometimes the problem is not the harm technology does, but the good it might do if only it were reconfigured to meet unmet demands. This case is exemplified by the Internet. It was created by the U.S. military to test a new type of network computer time sharing, but a graduate student came up with the idea of networking not only the computers, but also their users, and introduced email. Since then, one generation of users after another has developed and explored new ideas for social interaction on the Internet. Home pages were followed by web forums, and web forums by social sites dedicated to music sharing and photography. These sites were integrated into blogs, and now social sites such as MySpace and Facebook have emerged, pulling together many social resources. At each stage, programmers have worked to accommodate the new demands of users with the corresponding technical solutions. This is a process repeated endlessly as technologies develop. So this leads to my 8th paradox, which I will call the paradox of value and fact. Values are the facts of the future. Values are not the opposite of facts, subjective desires with no basis in reality. Values express aspects of reality that have not yet been incorporated into the taken-for-granted technical environment. That environment was shaped by the values that presided over its creation. Technologies are the crystallized expression of those values. New values open up established designs for revision. The democratic paradox. Social groups form around the technologies that mediate their relations, make possible their common identity, and shape their experience. We all belong to many such groups. Some are defined social categories, and the salience of technology to their experience is obvious. A worker in a factory, a nurse in a hospital, a truck driver in his truck, are all members of communities that exist through the technologies they employ. Consumers and victims of the side effects of technology form latent groups that surface when their members become aware of the shared reasons for their problems. The politics of technology grows out of these technical mediations that underlie the many social groups that make up society. Such encounters between the individuals and the technologies that connect them proliferate with consequences of all sorts. Social identities and worlds emerge together and form the backbone of a modern society. In the technology studies literature, this is called the co-construction of technology and society. The examples cited here show this co-construction resulting in never-typed feedback loops, like the drawing hands in M.C. Escher's famous print of that name. I want to use this image to discuss the underlying structure of the technology-society relationship. Escher's self-drawing hands are emblematic of the concept of the strange loop or entangled hierarchy introduced by Douglas Hofstadter in his book Gödel, Escher, Bach. The strange loop arises when moving up or down a logical hierarchy leads paradoxically back to the starting point. The logical hierarchy in this sense can include a relationship between actors and their objects, such as seeing and being seen, or talking and listening. The active side stands at the top, and the passive side at the bottom of these hierarchies. In the Escher print, the paradox is illustrated in a visible form. The hierarchy of drawing subject and drawn object is entangled by the fact that each hand plays both functions with respect to the other. They're drawing each other. I hope you can see that. You holding the pencil, it draws this hand, holding the pencil, it draws that hand. In the Escher print, the paradox is illustrated in visible form. The hierarchy of drawing subject and drawn object is entangled by the fact that each hand plays both functions with respect to the other. If we say the hand on the right is at the top of the hierarchy, drawing the hand on the left, we come up against the fact that the hand on the left draws the hand on the right, and so is also located at the top level. Thus, neither hand is at the top, or both are, which is contradictory. On Hofstadter's terms, the relation between technology and society is an entangled hierarchy. Insofar as social groups are constituted by the technical links that associate their members, their status is that of the drawn object in Escher's scheme. But they react back on those links in terms of their experience, drawing that which draws them. Once formed and conscious of their identity, technologically mediated groups influence technical design through their choices and protests. This feedback from society and technology constitutes the democratic paradox. The public is constituted by the technologies that bind it together, but in turn it transforms the technologies that constitute it. Neither society nor technology can be understood in isolation from each other, because neither has a stable identity or form. This paradox is endemic to democracy in general. Self-rule is an entangled hierarchy. As the French revolutionary Saint-Just put it, I think this was in 1791, quote, "The people is a submissive monarch and a free subject," end quote. That's an entangled hierarchy right there. Over the centuries since the democratic paradox was first enacted, its reach has extended from basic political issues of civil order and defense to embrace social issues such as marriage, education, and health care. The process of extending democracy to technology began with the labor movement. It called attention to the contradiction between democratic ideology and the tyranny of the factory. This was the first expression of the politics of technology at a time when technical mediation was confined to a single sector of society. The dream of control of the economy by those who build it with their brains and hands has never been fully realized. But today, around the many issues raised by technology, something very much like that dream is revived in new forms. Those who demand environmentally compatible production, a medical system more responsive to patient needs, a free and public internet, and many other democratic reforms of technology follow in the footsteps of the socialist movement, whether they know it or not. They are broadening democratic claims to cover the whole social terrain incorporated into the technological system. The last paradox, the paradox of contrast. Hofstadter's scheme has a limitation that does not apply in the case of technology. The strange loop is never more than a partial subsystem in a consistent, objectively conceived universe. Hofstadter evades ultimate paradox by positing an inviolate level of strictly hierarchical relations above the strange loop, and that makes it possible. He calls this level inviolate, it cannot be violated, because it is not logically entangled with the entangled hierarchy it creates. In the case of the Escher drawing, the paradox only exists because of the unparadoxical activity of the actual printmaker, Escher, who drew it in the ordinary way without being himself drawn by anyone. The notion of an inviolate level has its place in logic, but not in life in a technological society. In fact, the illusion of technique is precisely defined by this notion. This illusion gives rise to the popular belief that through technology we conquer nature. But human beings are natural beings, and so the progress of conquest is inherently paradoxical. This 10th paradox of conquest was succinctly formulated in another context by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The victor belongs to the spoils. You know what the spoils are, the spoils of war, the booty, the things that are stolen after the defeat. So here the victor belongs to the spoils. The conqueror of nature is despoiled by its own violent assault. This paradox has two implications. On the one hand, when humanity conquers nature, it merely arms some humans with more effective means to exploit and oppress other humans, who, as natural beings, are among the conquered subjects. On the other hand, as we have seen, actions that harm the natural environment come back to haunt the perpetrators in the form of pollution or other negative feedback from the system to which both conqueror and conquered belong. In sum, the things we as a society do to nature are also things we do to ourselves. In reality, there is no inviolate level, no equivalent of Escher in the real world of co-construction, no godlike agent creating technology and society from the outside. All the creative activity takes place in a world that is itself created by that activity. Only in our fantasies do we transcend the strange loops of technology and experience. In the real world, there is no escape from the logic of finitude. So, now the conclusion. The 10 paradoxes form a philosophy of technology that is remote from current views, but corresponds more nearly to experiences we have with increasing frequency. In rich countries, the internet and the environment are the two domains in which the paradoxes are most obviously at work. The many disorders of development illustrate their relevance in the rest of the world. Everywhere technology reveals its true complexity as it emerges from the cultural ghetto in which it was confined until recently. Today, technological issues routinely appear on the front pages of the newspapers. Fewer and fewer people imagine they can be left to the experts to decide. This is the occasion for the radical change in our understanding of technology. The institutionalized abstractions of the corporations and the technical professions are no longer the only standpoint. in which to understand technology. Now, it is more and more in the foreground of our everyday activities and provokes renewed philosophical reflection. So that's the end.
The question that I have is, by the way, I really like your speech. Could you just give us the definition of technology that you're referring to here? Because I think what I thought of technology might not be
Well, this is a semantic question, right? In the broad sense, technology would be all the artifacts that do work for us and that change the environment. More narrowly considered, we think of technology in contrast, for example, to craft. We think of technology as modern technology. So it involves larger scales of operation, more sophisticated knowledge of nature, right? Formalized knowledge of nature, for example, engineering, kind of things that are part of KAIST. So in general, I'm not including in the term technology social relations, even social relations that have a character of technical control. So I wouldn't call, for example, a bureaucratic hierarchy of technology. However, a bureaucratic hierarchy probably can't exist without technology, without writing technology, filing technology, and so on. So it's imbricated in technology.
The question is about the first paradox, where you talked about the paradox of a whole and a part. Yeah. So when you talk about technology and like carburetor and things like that, I can understand it, but I see no point of saying the same arguments and same statements about like the bird or its wing. Because if you think about, let's say, human body, we have so many cells that compose our body, but I don't think the cell on my left hand is aware of the cell on my right hand. And each of them is a whole by itself, right? It's a system which does live and has a drive to survive. But they also compose me as another system, another whole all together. So do you think the way you compared it to the bird and the wing is really has a place of that comparison? Do you think it's okay to do such a comparison between technology and between the real life?
Well, I mean, there's clearly a difference between an organic whole, like the body, and a mechanical whole, like an automobile. And it's a big difference because the parts of an organic whole die almost immediately. You separate them. Right? Whereas the parts of an automobile are perfectly happy to sit there in a storehouse forever until they're ready to be assembled. So it's a question, in a way, of a continuum, right? Going from things that are disconnected, things that are mechanically connected, things that are organically connected. And it's hard for us to think clearly about the members of this continuum. Like, what is society? Is it a mechanical or is it an organic entity, right? It's certainly not an entity in which there's no connection, right? Because people can't live without other people. So what I was trying to do in the first part was to bring out this complexity of systems and the differences between systems. And the fact that our common sense tends to want to think in terms of separate things. We have an Aristotelian common sense in the Hegelian world, all right, where everything is connected in some way, but the subtle differences in the way things are connected are not normally part of our common sense understanding of things, because we have this Aristotelian idea that everything is a separate thing and they're not essentially connected. So that's what I was trying to accomplish by those examples.
Thank you.
I think your ideas are very interesting, and I can agree with them. But I think you are just describing the history and you are explaining the paradoxes. But in conclusion, you are saying about the nowadays people are participating in technological issues and science issues. can you explain how can we, do you have any suggestions or normative suggestions with your ideas?
You mean normative suggestions in the sense of moral rules that should dictate our behavior in intervening in technology? Well, I think the principle, the principal norms are obvious ones, right? Like we should protect people's health, we should open opportunities for communication. These are sort of values that are modern values, right? That everyone in modern societies accepts, and they should be embodied in a democratic context. You would expect them to be embodied in the framework of everyday life. Justifying those values at some more fundamental level, with some abstract normative theory, is difficult, but probably not necessary if the reference is to democratic decision. Right? But of course, some kind of normative justification of basic human rights is very important for guiding discussion in modern societies. But those remain quite abstract and don't dictate particulars. I mean, a certain level of risk is associated with every technology. So what's the tolerable level? There's no abstract normative theory that could tell you the answer, right? So you need then, so where do you get the answer? Well, it has to come from people. I had a student once who heard me say some of these things, and he said, that's all. He says, that's not the way it works. He says, I work for the city, and we have to put stop signs on streets. And we get all these calls from people, dumb people who want a stop sign on their street. So we go out there with a cord, that measures the flow of traffic. And, there's no reason for a stop sign there. So he's dismissing the evidence of experience that I'm talking about, right? So then I said to him, where do you think the current standard came from? Why is there a certain number of cars per hour that has to go over your measuring device for you to put a stop sign in? You think that God gave you this number? Where did it come from? There must have a history, like those exit signs. So I think in the end, if we want to know about risk, which is a very, very major factor, right, in technical policy, we have to look to what people demand, and when they're alerted to the existence of this, and that's the only source we have for values, for norms, is democratic decisions.
I have a question that concerns two of the paradoxes. One is action, and the other one is the one about identity. And so my question is, what are people who are non-users of the technology that we define? Like a radical example might be like indigenous people. They don't really make use of any modern technology. So if they don't make use of technology that you are referring to, then does that mean that they don't have identity? Or, which I see your answer would be no, but what happens to their identity? They don't make use of modern technology. The second one is the one about action. Like what goes around should come around at one point in time. Then what happens to the consequences? I mean, what do you think about the consequences that non-users of technology should pay for the actions that were made by the users of technology?
The first question has to do with, really what you're asking is what are other sources of identity aside from consumption and industrial work? And there must be other sources because people have identities long before there was a modern society. So I think religion, for example, what we call religion, which is of course already a modern idea. There's no such thing as religion in pre-modern societies. There's belief systems that you think of as belief systems of some sort, but they incorporate often what we think of as science and art and so on, all in a single whole. And from that, people derive their identity until recent times. Now, those systems have all been separated out, each one in its place. They no longer have a power to define us, we're defined in a different way through work and consumption. So, as for the second question, non-users are implicated. You have to think of technology as creating networks of people and things. And those networks do not only involve workers and consumers, right? They may involve many other people who suffer from the externalities of the technical activity. Pollution affects third parties who are non-users. Right? They're not workers, they're not consumers of the products made in the factory, they're just the people who have to breathe the air that comes out of the factory because they live in the neighborhood. And these non-users are seen in a modern society by the owners of a capitalist enterprise as irrelevant until they go to court and sue or protest in some way. Right? They're irrelevant. They have to make themselves known. They're sort of silent partners in the business, right? Because the business profits from their passivity and their ignorance. It can save the cost of cleaning up the smoke that comes out of the smokestack. Right? Once those people make themselves known, then they say, well, we've always been part of your network. Just an unconscious part. Now we're conscious that we're part of your network, and we demand that you incorporate our help into your network, into your technology. And so at that point, I mean, the chimney gets equipped, right, with purifiers, the company has to pay for that, and advances more.
But not everyone is in a position to be able to
protest?
Yeah. Like, if you look at it that way, then, like, it's a closed system after all. It's considered a big picture. And who isn't irrelevant? Everybody is relevant.
I think, of course, everyone in the modern society, nothing is untouched by technology. Many of the latent groups that are formed by these connections are, you know, they're perfectly okay. We don't want to open up every black box and find out we don't want to meet the guys who made all the equipment in this room. They did a good job. There's no problem, except maybe it was the lights. So it's only those networks that produce harm or that have potentials that have not been actualized by the people who control that cause a passage of a latent group into an active group. And of course, there are many cases where people are powerless. They're too ignorant to resist what's done to them, or they try and resist and the police come and beat them up, or, I mean, you know, you don't always win. And then there are also groups that have stupid ideas that form around problems that don't even exist, that are completely imaginary. All those people who don't want to vaccinate their children, I don't know if that's a movement here, but in North America, it's a big deal. You know, there's nothing to it. It's been studied over and over, and there's nothing to it. So, of course, it's possible that science is wrong, but we don't have a better guy. I mean, a rumor on the internet is not a better guy. So you know, this is democracy, right? Not every interest is served, not every right is respected, not every decision is good, but on the whole, it works better than closing things down.
I have a question related to your 8th paradox, the paradox of value and fact. You mentioned here, at first you must figure out how to formulate values and follow technical classification. And I'm wondering, like, I think I can see the cases which cannot be backed up by formulating process of evidence, which, like, there can be an experience, there are experiences, there are claims, but you cannot transform it into the scientific terms, you know, like, such as climate change. It's so complex, so you cannot, like, numerous scientists are hanging on the problem because they cannot solve the problem, right? So in that case, but still we have to take an action, right? Government have to take an action. So in that case, I still see the problem. So, but So how can we take an action in that case?
You're thinking of cases where we know what we want, but no one knows how to translate that into technical terms?
Yeah.
In the case of climate change, we would like to enjoy all the benefits of a modern society without the weather going crazy on us. But we don't know how to do this because we can't enjoy those benefits without burning a lot of fossil fuel. So it seems like an insoluble technical problem. It is conceivable that industrial civilization is doomed, and that we'll never find a solution, and we'll have to, invent some completely different way of life, in which people have much less mobility and many fewer things. That's possible, but it's also, I think, worth trying to solve the problem. To keep on struggling to solve the problem, and at this point in time. It looks to me like the main problem is not the difficulty scientists have translating values into facts. The main problem is politics, right, and culture. People don't want to make any sacrifices. They want their cake, to have their cake and eat it, and say it in English. They want to be able to drive around everywhere, right, while protecting the environment. So they need some kind of magic to do this, but they haven't yet found the spell. So until people actually accept that they're going to have to pay the price of change, we're stuck. I think there are certainly values that cannot be translated into facts because technology is not sophisticated enough to address the need. That's certainly the case with all kinds of medical issues, right? But it's a continuous process. The horizon continually recedes, but there are advances made, so it's unusual that large masses of people protest for something that's impossible. Right? It does happen occasionally, but mostly the protests are for things that are not only possible, but damn it, should have been done years ago. So that's the sense in which, there's an element of exaggeration in all of my paradoxes. Right? That's the sense in which I'm trying to do.
I have a question about the last paradox. It's a rather simple question, but you said that whatever action that harms the environment comes back with a negative feedback, right?
Yeah.
But personally, I believe that technological development itself harms the environment inevitably because of harmful emissions, right? So I want to ask you if you think there is a way for environment and science to coexist without one harming the other, or if technological development will continue to harm the environment.
Well, there's an awful lot of technology that's fairly innocent, and the harm comes from certain specific technology. So I don't think that a global combination of science and technology is justified by facts. Harm is a strong word. You could say that there's harm when all the fish in a river are killed by industrial waste flowing to the river. But is it harm if a smaller amount of waste goes into the river and the population of the river changes slightly? Obviously, there's a Hindu sect in India where people wear masks so they won't kill a gnat. So, if you wanted to reduce your footprint on the earth to zero, you'd have a difficult time doing it. I think people will interfere with all kinds of natural processes without setting off alarm bells. And if we could get the entire industrial system to operate without setting off alarm bells, like global warming and fish kills and air pollution causing medical problems and so on, that would be a great achievement. But we still, alter the environment in various ways, and we still be a problematic creature.
I found that you treat technology as some kind of organism. I found in your space. Do you really think the technology can do something to society itself by itself? In my position, technology is product of another product of society.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's what the idea of co-construction is about. Yeah, technology doesn't have its own kind of motive. It's part of the social process. It's true that in traditional societies, there's really no difference between technology, craft technologies, and any other activity. In modern societies, we have specialized technical disciplines. Right? So we've changed the position of technology with respect to other social processes in a significant way. But even those specialized technical disciplines incorporate social decisions unconsciously. Maybe the engineer isn't aware of the origins of the standards that his work must conform to, but that origin is understandable through a social and historical approach.
But in my concept, technology is a very abstract concept.
Yeah.
Technology can project it to component of society, and the component and element can do something, but the social constructivity said that technology can do something right and directly to society. I cannot agree with it.
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, it's true that when you introduce a new technology, say mobile phones, introduced in Korea at a certain date, and as a result, people behave differently than they had before. They did different things and so on. You could say that technology has a social impact. But then it's a circular process, right? I mean, what is it via telephone? That's a product of a social history that's been studied. And we know how the telephone evolved. For example, the most obvious thing about a telephone is that it's an instrument of social interaction. But that was not the original purpose of the telephone. That was a user invention. Users colonized the telephone with social interaction. Originally, the telephone was for business and official communications. What the mobile phone does is not something that comes from the heaven of pure reason, right? It's a further extension of something that happened in the 1920s, which was a user-initiated change in the purpose and the nature of the telephone. So that's the way I understand it. I'm not sure I've understood your question, but I hope I'm responding to it.
It was interesting to me to see that you employed ecological metaphors of time. Then my overall impression that I got from the talk about technology is that technology or technological system is like an ecological system in which technology that human beings are interconnected in a real, complicated ways, linked by various positive and negative, feedback, and also successes and failures are dependent upon, contingent factors like, survival and extinctions are dependent upon contingent factors and meanings and trajectories are predetermined. So, if I'm correct, this new image of technology, I think, it poses a great challenge to technology policy makers, most of whom still have a very, naive, positivistic ideas about technology. So, a lot of people here are studying, technology policy. So, do you have anything, to say? To technological policy makers,
Well, study a lot of history of technology. So you don't have illusions about what it is and how it works. Study history and sociology of technology. And I have that's one piece of advice. The second piece of advice is don't believe everything you're told by MIT. Well, KAIST, I don't know enough about it. I trust it.
I have a question about your ninth paradox, the paradox of democracy. I like the idea of co-construction, but while you link the idea of co-construction to your paradox of democracy, I think I don't see kind of the co-constructive activity outside of the market system. So my concern is your notion of democracy is reducible to the notion of market system? Because the most cases what you talked about here is it happened within the market system. So I was a little bit confusing about your notion of democracy and market here.
It doesn't, I mean, the fact that there are markets everywhere means that almost everything has some connection to the market system. It doesn't mean that it's about individual purchasing. For example, what I said about the telephone, obviously telephone subscriptions were sold on the market, but the use put to them was something that was innovated by, essentially by women in rural areas. So they just decided to use it for other purposes than it was intended for. They transformed its needs. So the same thing happened with the computer. Right? What was a computer? Sold on markets, of course, but what transformed its meaning was the internet and turned it into a communication device, which it wasn't before. So markets are one way in which people influence industry. If people don't want to buy a product, then it's going to go out of existence and be changed so that people will want it again or whatever. And it's only one way, and it happens to be a way which rests on the unconscious summation of individual decisions. So I wouldn't. It's not really democratic. I mean, it's not bad because it's not democratic. It's good that people have the choice of what kind of blue jeans to wear and so on, where to eat. But democracy, I think, involves public discussion, public action, and not just purchasing decisions. So that is important. It's an important distinction because the purchasing decisions can't get to the heart of the externalities caused by industry, and it can't get to the potentials that are unexploited. You need some other mode of intervention.
Just a quick question. These days, a lot of people are talking about social technology, but I think the term is very slippery. Do you have any good definition of it?
Well, it's a mysterious concept. I was invited to give a talk to the international meeting of the Social Technology Network in Brasilia, in Brazil, a few years ago. The Social Technology Network wanted to hear, essentially that's the origin of this talk. It came out of that talk, with the addition of further paragraphs. So I asked them, what is social technology? It took a long time to get an answer. And someone finally did explain it, as they understand it in Latin America, which is the only association I have with the concept. It's a kind of successor to the appropriate technology movement. Appropriate technology was supposed to be technology suited to underdeveloped countries, to poor communities, because it was more primitive than modern technology, but good for doing the job in a local situation. But the people who devised those technologies did not consider the social insertion of the technology. They just thought if it works, it will be adopted and successful. It turns out that isn't true. It matters what the social consequences are of the technology and the social conditions for its success. So, I mean, if the technology is supposed to do something with excrement, right, to make it a valuable source of natural gas or whatever, fertilizer, I don't remember the example I was giving, that's all very well and good, but suddenly it changes excrement from waste into a commodity. So that transformation has to be taken into account in understanding the establishment of this technology in the village. And so on, many examples are given to this sort of thing. So social technology is supposed to be like appropriate technology, but with a social conscience, understanding how the effects of the technology and the conditions for its success. So that was the definition I was given in Brazil.
Some people are talking Twitter as a social technology.
I mean, that's a completely different use of the word. Yeah, it's a social technology in the sense that it mediates the interaction of human beings in social groups. So it's different from telephone, which is one-to-one. It's different from broadcasting, which is one-to-many. Right? It's many-to-many. And you could use the term social technology to refer to those kinds of technology. Yep.
My name is Kanye. I was president and system among the 10 paradoxes is your memory.
Well, I like the paradox of action. Yeah, that's the cutest. It's the most philosophically profound paradox. It's about human dignity.